Perfect. I think, for those that has already waited, so I think for the sake of that, let's start the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for your patience and also for moving the app. I appreciate your understanding. And today, would love to um, introduce to you German Sie, who is the Manager of Renewable Gas and Compliance from Forties BC. And today, our webinar is titled Fuel the Future, Navigating Canada's Clean Fuel Regulation. And today, I'd like to, if everyone can see my screen, I'm making sure that everyone can do that. Perfect. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce German. So German here is professional engineer with a deep commitment in advancing clean energy. He's passionate about climate change issues and advancing lower carbon fuels to meet rising energy demand. Today, he oversees regulatory compliance and life cycle analysis for Fortis BC's renewable natural gas portfolio, and his work includes managing compliance requirements across multiple carbon credit markets. So, German, glad to have you here today. I know we've had some hiccups in the connection, but I appreciate you to be here today and sharing with us about Canada CFR and its latest updates.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Tim. Will you be driving the slide deck or?
Yes,
Sure.
I won't be doing that. So, German, thank you for preparing the presentation about the practical overview of CFR. I'll let you take it from here and let me move the slide deck forward.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone, again, for your patience. Seems like my work computer had some issues, but here we are. So in terms of the clean fuel regulation, I'd like to start with the why. So the why is always important, and why kind of the clean fuel regulation exists. The second item, and it's a very big regulation, right? It's a very broad regulation. That's why really busy speaking to that in a short period of time. I like to maybe hit the highlights here, right? And speaking about who's involved, as well as what are CFR credits. And finally, I'd like to leave you with resources that you can sort of like access to get more detailed information. Next slide, please.
Yes.
So transportation is a large emissions pie of any developed economy. And really, basically, the CFR is to address emissions in the transportation sector. And very simplistically drawn here is a vehicle, and the box that I sort of drew in there, that's your fuel tank. If we talk about regular internal combustion engine, and the one thing that we need to recognize is that there is a lot that goes into for this fuel to show up in your tank. Next slide, please. And that is what we call the upstream emissions. So as you can see, I kind of made this very large, right? So you can see there's a lot of activities that really need to happen for this fuel to show up in the fuel tank, right? It's very complicated. More complicated than obviously what you would think about when you drive up the gas station, right, and fill up your tank, because there's a lot of activities that need to happen upstream. Next slide, please. And that's sort of like where the regulations that exist to support the reduction in emissions reduction for transportation is focused on two areas. One, I'd like to start with the downstream one, because that's kind of the one that's a bit more in the public's face, right? And as an example here, provided EV mandates and EV rebates, right? And there's a lot of vehicle technologies that have developed over the last 5 to 10 years more rapidly, right? And that's kind of the one that many people are more familiar with versus kind of the upstream regulations, such as the clean fuel regulation, or on the state side of things, the RFS are something that's not as kind of well known, but really sort of like it tackles the emissions in the transportation sector holistically, right? So one on the downstream side of things, but also secondly on the upstream side of things. Next slide, please. Here I'm providing a comparison of two kind of very different types of regulations to target those emissions reduction in the transportation sector. So one is called the Renewable Fuel Mandate, and the Renewable Fuel Mandate requires volumes of renewable fuels to be supplied in the overall fossil fuel portfolio. And that is where the credits that can be generated in the renewable fuel mandate are tied to volumes of renewable fuels, versus the clean fuel standard looks at carbon intensity and carbon reduction. So fuel producers, they must achieve a reduction in carbon intensity of the fuel that they supply to the market. And emissions reduction are rewarded with credits that represent tons of greenhouse gas reduction. And on the renewable fuel mandate, an example of that is the US Renewable Fuel Standard, versus on the clean fuel standard, that's kind of where the CFR is the one that we'll be talking about, but also the California LCFS and the BC LCFS. Next slide, please. Here's an overview of the BC LCFS, the California LCFS. LCFS stands for Low Carbon Fuel Standard, and the Canada Clean Fuel Regulation. All three of them are clean fuel standards. And what you see with the Clean Fuel Regulation is that that is the newest of the three, and it was brought to market in June of 2022. And the other two low carbon fuel standards, as you can see, just started in 2010, so definitely much earlier. But what's really interesting is that these kind of regulations are sort of like designed for a target date of 2030. And that is also true for the Canada Fuel Regulation, right? It's the newest program. And that's sort of like where I'll speak also about kind of what's down the road in terms of the Canada Fuel Regulation. Next slide, please. So who's involved in the CFR? So it being a liquid fuel program, the primary suppliers are obligated parties, though, so they need to follow regulation, and they have to meet the regulation, meaning that they need to basically achieve those emissions reduction. Again, I mentioned that it is an emissions reduction focused regulation, and they can do that by reducing the carbon intensity of their own fuel, but also they can meet compliance by pulling CFR credits, which are emissions reduction achieved somewhere else. They can pull on those credits to come into compliance. Versus the second biggest group are the voluntary credit creators. And the voluntary credit creators are generally or are not parties that are obligated to participate under this regulation. Rather, as the name suggests, they're basically participating voluntarily, right? And that is typically through the production and to bringing those low carbon intensity fuels to use. And those compliance credits that are being generated by the voluntary credit creators are then brought to market, so the primary fuel suppliers who need additional emissions reduction in order to come to compliance, they can basically utilize those credits in order to come to compliance. Next slide, please. So there are generally three credit classes. So CC stands for compliance category. And the three compliance categories are compliance category 1, 2, and 3. Unless you are a primary fuel supplier, you will not get involved in compliance category 1, where voluntary credit creators get involved in our compliance category 2 and compliance category 3. Compliance category 2 is for producing and importing low carbon intensity fuels and bring that to use in Canada. And in the context of renewable natural gas, that is, for instance, where renewable natural gas is blended into a network in Canada and brought to use in Canada. Versus on the compliance category 3, it's called fueling advancing advanced vehicle technology. And that's sort of like where vehicle technologies such as electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cells, the use of RNG and LNG and CNG vehicles will basically has the opportunity to generate compliance category 3 credits for the displacement of liquid fuels, and that's why compliance category 3 is also referred to as liquid class credits, and compliance category 2 is also referred to as gaseous class credits. The two things I like to highlight here is that within the clean fuel regulation, compliance can only be achieved by primary fuel supplier within the space of the clean fuel regulation. And what I mean by that is that they must obtain clean CFR credits if they are short with regards to the compliance to meet the compliance requirement. They cannot bring in carbon credits or fuel credits of other programs, such as in Canada. If that facility is located in BC, they cannot use BC LCFS credits. They must basically tap into the CFR credit market. And so there's a difference between compliance category 2 versus compliance category 3. So there is limitations on the primary fuel supplier side of things with regards to how many CC2 credits can be utilized to meet the compliance versus that cap doesn't exist in the liquid fuel class. Next slide, please. So this slide here is to provide you more resources, and the first link is just the regulation itself. It's a little bit difficult to read, and I provided the link to the Google Drive as well. So in the Google Drive, ECCC Environment and Climate Change Canada has provided a lot of guidance document that explain the regulation in a more kind of plain language. So if you want to learn more, I encourage you to go to the Google Drive and look through it. It's a publicly available drive, and you can go through the documents here, see what's there, as well as getting on the email list. And then if you're generally interested about life cycle assessment, I provided a link to a micro-certificate program that you can sign up for, and that will provide you more details around life cycle assessment. And I think that takes me to the end of my presentation, Tim.
Yes. Thanks, Jeremy, for that. We really appreciate the overview. I think there's a question that came in, and I think this is a good time to segue to our next part of the webinar, which is more the questions around one of the things that came up is Canada saw an increase over 400% jump in RNG volumes registered under the CFR in the period of 2023 to 2024. From your experience at Fortis BC, what have you seen drove that surge?
Yeah. So I'd like to maybe clarify. So when we speak about those years like 2024, right, then this is the 2024 compliance period. And the one thing you need to understand with this regulation is that the activities are lagging, right? So in order to basically generate credits for the 2024 compliance period, these activities happened in 2025. And I attribute that to two things. So number one, to the change and update in the fuel LCA specification. The fuel LCA specification, you need to think about kind of the rules, how you basically develop your carbon intensity model, which then basically governs how many carbon credits you can actually achieve. And there have been quite a few iterations of this fuel LCA specification. And in 2020, 2024, there was a fairly active year to update that fuel LCA specification. And with regard to renewable natural gas, the changes were very substantial so that many people in the industry, because these have been out in consultation for a while, so many people have actually waited for these fuel LCA specification to be released so they can actually be used. And we wanted to use that, right, because not only it was more practical, but also it was more favorable with regards to the carbon intensity in order to achieve a better credit volume. So that was number one. But number two, in 2025, we also had the federal election. So there was definitely a bit of kind of hesitation with regards to putting effort, time, and money, because you need to work with auditors, and those auditors cost money, right? So many people were basically just waiting out to see what happens in this election. And what happens is that the Liberal government got reelected versus the conservative government, which was really close in the race, right? They didn't make that race, right? And I think many people were really waiting to see what happens, right? And when the federal government got reelected again, I think that kind of momentum really then built up again. People really had this confidence and really put their money and time into it. So for me, it's kind of a combination of these two things.
Thanks, German, for that overview. I think you mentioned before about a CI, and I'm sure that folks want to know more about that in practice. So for an RNG producer, producing RNG from dairy manure, landfill, how does the CI calculation work under the CFR? Maybe you can start with, what are the different type of feedstocks that you've seen under the CFR? How
Mhm.
does the CI calculation work, and how does that differ from, for example, California's LCFS or even BC's LCFS? Could you give an overview about that?
Sure, absolutely. I'd like to start with the feedstock maybe.
Hmm.
And feedstock is certainly a very key criteria under the clean fuel regulation, where it's very specific with regards to which feedstocks are eligible to participate in order to produce a low carbon intensity fuel. So generally speaking, for renewable natural gas, it has to be a biogenic feedstock, right? It needs to be free of fossil fuel, but also very strict with regards to that it cannot have other negative impacts, right? And this is this whole food versus fuel discussion. So it cannot be a purposely grown crop, for instance, right? So the predominant feedstocks that we see in the renewable natural gas are waste feedstocks, right? So whether it's waste feedstock from industrial food manufacturing, for instance, right? But also waste feedstocks from, say, curbside collection programs in terms of green bin waste, or really difficult to process waste, such as packaged waste that needs to be depackaged, right? So that's sort of like on the organic waste side of things, versus on the manure side of things, it's pretty broad, right? It can be dairy manure, it can be cattle, it can be beef manure, right? So definitely a very broad range of manure that's acceptable to be included in the fuel production process. And when it comes to carbon intensity, so carbon intensity is really basically a metric, and the metric of the carbon intensity is grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of fuel production. And that CO2 equivalent is basically adding up all the carbon this goes into making that fuel, right? Whether it's tracking feedstock, whether it's running the plant, whether or not it's pushing the fuel down to where it needs to be used, up to basically the end use. And that's sort of like where on a life cycle basis, hence basically life cycle assessment, we look at all different stages, right? And that's like what I mentioned with that the fuel LCA specification really needed to be developed. And that's something that wasn't quite developed as well in the early days of the fuel LCA specification. While in 2024, for instance, there's now guidance around what are basically avoided emissions of feedstock, for instance, right? So imagine you are depackaging waste, you're basically taking contaminated waste. So what would happen otherwise to this this waste is it would go to landfill, right? And that's where you basically get the credit from diverting it from landfill into a fuel production facility. And that's sort of like where you potentially may receive a fairly favorable carbon intensity because you're basically avoiding something from happening, right? And that's something that's very, very clear in this regulation that you need to have a really strong case what would happen to this waste otherwise, right? And only if you can make a case with regards to what would happen to this waste otherwise, you're potentially able to generate a better CI score with regards to reduced emissions, right? And the one thing that I do see and I'm not really familiar in detail with the California LCFS, but from what I've seen in the California LCFS, there's a strong favoritism towards manure-based RNG production. So dairy-based manure RNG production, I've seen it with very deep negative carbon intensities. And we don't see that under the CFR, and we don't see that under the BC LCFS. And that often has to do with something called secondary data. So what secondary data is these are basically default values that are baked in the CI model, right? So all these 3 different programs pull in different CI models, right? The BC LCFS uses something that's called Genius. California LCFS uses something called the GREET model, and the CFR uses something called OpenLCA, and they're all different default values baked into it, which are those secondary values. And in parts, the reason why the results are different are because of different default values baked into it.
Thanks for that overview, German. I think that is really helpful for folks to understand. And one of the things that we've also seen why the market is so attractive is because of obviously the prices of CFR credits, um, which is around the range of 300 to 320 Canadian
Mm.
dollars. And with that, I'm sure folks would want to know, like, to register new projects under the CFR, how long does this, pathway approval process typically take? And what are the most common bottlenecks that you've seen?
Yeah, yeah. To be honest, I've been really amazed with this program when it was put to market in 2022, because obviously it's a nationwide program, right? So basically it covers Canada as a whole, right? But also where I was really, really amazed with is that it really covers a huge range of different fuels, right? Fuels that we would expect, whether it's a renewable natural gas, whether it's ethanol, whether it's biodiesel, whether it's hydrogen, right? But it covers also a lot of very specialty fuels, right, such as renewable propane. And with that, I think it was a bit of a kind of double-edged sword. It's great, right, because you're basically providing options and you're not excluding anyone, but also at the same time, there was just a lot for ECCC to manage, right? I think that's sort of like why when the change happened in 2024 with the fuel LCA specification and very, very fundamental issues had to be addressed, it was sort of like a little bit not by surprise because there was so much sort of like that really needed to be tackled, right? And that's why I really think that in the early days of the program, it was a very, very sluggish program because the team in the federal government, they're only so big, right? And they have so much to deal with that sort of like in the beginning, certainly it was quite sluggish, but also I think a lot of people were really trying to learn how this works, right? So there was a lot of influx of information requests and back and forth, which really bogged down the system on the ECCC side of things, right? And that's why I think the timelines we've seen historically are not reflective of what the timelines are today, right? Because the LCAs are much more clearer, right? People have more experience, people are talking to each other. So we have definitely seen timelines of like 1 to 1.5 years in terms of getting a CI approved by the ECCC, for instance, right? Versus now we definitely see that shrinking down. And so the one thing is also seen is that ECCC has been fairly good with understanding where are urgencies, right? Because there's activities that need to happen at a certain timeline, right? Otherwise, you lose potentially opportunity to generate credits. And they've been really good at prioritizing, kind of going through all the applications they have and knowing who they need to talk to. And that's something that we have appreciated really greatly working with ECCC. So that's sort of like where I kind of really want to provide the audience here a bit the assurance that I think things have gotten better. And also say whether you work with consultants have also learned a lot, right? Or you work with a verified auditor, for instance, right? So now there are also more auditors available that can do that work, right? And they have obviously done a lot more work to sort of like really basically, like help you throughout the process, right? So I do think that we are in a place where things are slightly much more manageable and in line with what one would expect in terms of going through the process.
Thank you. Um, we really appreciate that. And I think there's another question, and I think we have room for this one last question before we have to close out the webinar. Since CFR is a dynamic regulation, from what you've seen in the last few years, where do you think this regulation is headed, and what would that look like in the future, especially as these projects are multi-year projects, and of course, folks would owner operators would want to hedge their risk and reduce risk as much as possible. But from what you're seeing, I know you mentioned earlier that you've seen a lot of improvements in the regulation. Curious to know where you think it's headed.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Like as I showed you earlier, kind of the targets are set to 2030, and in all reality, 2030 is really just around the corner, right? And definitely, consultation is a long process, right? So I would definitely imagine that consultation for basically anything beyond 2030 will have to start within a year and a half at the very latest, right? And I feel like once these consultations are out, they will give us a good indications to kind of where we'll be going with that, right? But the one thing that I do truly believe, and that's what we're seeing, especially when we have the federal government, the Liberal government coming back in, is that we have these discussions, right? What's going to happen to the CFR? And the general kind of consent is that there's a lot of investment that had to be made, whether it's on the primary fuel supply side of things, but also on the voluntary credit creator side of things, right? The industry, that it would be very unreasonable or not responsible from the federal government to not continue that program, right? But to answer your question, Tim, so my really recommendation to basically project developers is to not put your eggs in one basket, right? To CFR is one side of things, right? But I also know that in the US, you have the tax credits, right? Basically utilize everything that's out there, right? Because the clean fuel regulation itself, right? Not only the 2030, but also within the clean fuel regulation that we're in right now, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? As you said, the market price is really high, but we don't know what the market price is going to look like next year, right? So my recommendation definitely is to basically utilize whatever's out there rather than sort of like focusing on just the clean fuel regulation itself.
Okay. Thank you very much, German. I think this has been a, a brief but insightful information that you've shared about the CFR. And for folks that would want a deeper dive into the CFR, this is how you can reach German, as well as myself. And thank you so much for tuning in to this webinar. We appreciate your patience and also moving platforms from Go to Google Meet. And I believe, German, you have some resources, links to some resource. And is that something that we can share with the attendees of the webinar?
Absolutely. These are all public-facing documents, so for sure.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. We appreciate you taking the time, and looking forward to seeing you in the future webinars. And thank you, German, for taking the time and providing that overview.
Thank you so much.